The shovel hit the metal plate with a sound so sharp it felt like a physical punch to my chest, snapping me out of dead sleep and sending me straight into a headspace I hadn't in Oppos touched since my last tour in the valley. It was 2:14 in the morning out here in Big Sky Country, a place where the wind usually does all the talking, but tonight it was the sound of iron meeting steel at the edge of my southern aquifer. I didn't in Oppos reach for my phone to call the cops because out here the law is usually 40 minutes away and drinking coffee at a gas station. So instead, I grabbed the Remington 870 I keep by the bed and slipped out the back door without making a sound, moving through the tall grass the way I was trained to do when the stakes were a lot higher than a property line. Under the dim, flickering light of a heavy-duty tarp they'd rigged up, I saw 3 men, 2 jumpy to be professionals and 2 sloppy to be thieves, sweating over a hole they'd dug right where my grandfather's old well casing sat. Behind them, a matte, black G-Wagon idled with its headlights cut, looking like a predator waiting in the shadows, and for a second, I just watched them, my heart hammering against my ribs not out of fear, but out of a cold, hard realization that someone was trying to unearth the one thing my gramps told me to protect with my life. I stepped into the light, keeping the shotgun low but visible, and just said, and quote, "Hand where I can see them, and do it yesterday," end quote. And you'd have thought I'd dropped a grenade in that hole by the way they scrambled. 2 of them froze like deer in the high beams, but the third one, a wiry guy with a face I didn't in Oppos recognize, bolted into the brush, leaving behind a folder sitting on the leather seat of that idling SUV. I didn't in Oppos chase him because my eyes were locked on that folder. It had my name, Jackson Thorne, printed on the tab in clean, corporate block letters, and that's when I knew this wasn't Oppos. Just a random trespass. This was a hit. A few days later, a woman named Diana Sterling showed up at my gate. And let me tell you, she didn't in Oppos introduce herself so much as she tried to annex my soul. She stepped out of that same G-Wagon looking like she'd stepped off a yacht in the Hamptons. White power suit, hair sprayed into a structural marvel, and a smile that looked like it had been surgically applied and never quite reached her eyes. She didn't in Oppos say hello. She didn't in Oppos asked how my morning was. She just slapped a laminated notice onto my 100-year-old fence post and told me, and quote, "Mr. Thorne, you are currently in arrears to the Blackwood Heights HOA for exactly $112,000 in accumulated violations," end quote. And she said it with the kind of casual confidence people usually reserve for ordering a latte. I just stood there, leaning against the wood, and told her as calmly as I could that this ranch, the Broken Spur, had been in my family since before her little suburban utopia was even a blueprint in some developer into Oppos. S-head, and that we weren't into Oppos. Part of any HOA. Diana just tilted her head, giving me that look. You know the one, that end quote. "Oh, you poor uneducated thing," end quote. Look, and said, end quote, "The Blackwood Heights expansion jurisdiction was ratified last month, covering all 62 acres of this property. Failure to settle will trigger immediate foreclosure proceedings," end quote. It was a classic power move, a total rewrite of reality delivered in 2 sentences. And as I watched her drive away, I noticed her glove box was overflowing with county records dated weeks before she ever even stepped onto my dirt. This wasn't an Oppos, a misunderstanding. It was a siege, and she'd been planning it while I was still busy unpacking my grandfather's old journals. The next morning, it was like my fence had sprouted paper overnight. I had 6 different notices for, end quote, unapproved structures, end quote, unauthorized livestock, end quote, and my personal favorite, end quote, excessive dust displacement, end quote, which is basically just a fancy way of saying I live in the mountains. I started cataloging everything because when you're in recon, the first thing you do is map the threat before you ever fire a shot, but things got weird fast. I found an envelope tucked into my mailbox with a glossy photo inside. A picture of the inside of my tool shed, specifically the heavy steel floor safe I keep locked under a pile of burlap. No note, no signature, just the photo, and I knew for a fact nobody had been in that shed since I'd come home, at least not legally. By noon, 2 guys in city code enforcement vests showed up, and they were the kind of clean that tells you they've never actually done a day's labor in their lives. They started measuring the distance between my barn beams, beams that had survived the Great Depression and acting like they'd found a ticking bomb every time they saw a rusted nail. I walked with them, watching how they followed a pre-printed packet to the letter, and it hit me. The packet was dictating the inspection, not the other way around. They weren't and oppos. There to find violations. They were there to justify a conclusion that Diana had already reached. When I got back from supply run that afternoon, a bright orange in quote, condemned in quote, tag was nailed to my barn door so hard the wood had splintered and my phone started buzzing with an Austin area code. It was a guy from my bank, sounding real apologetic but firm, telling me they placed an administrative freeze on all my accounts because of a civil lien filed by Blackwood Heights for that $100,000 balance. That was the moment the air got real thin, because without that liquidity, I couldn't in oppos. Buy feed, I couldn't in oppos. Pay for the diesel to run the generator, and I sure as hell couldn't in oppos. Fight a legal battle. It was strategic suffocation, plain and simple. They wanted me broke, desperate, and willing to sign anything just to keep the lights on. The next few days felt like living under a microscope. I'd see fire marshal trucks crawling past my gate at 6 a.m., white vans with animal control logos idling at the ridge, and tax assessor sedans just sitting there, watching. It was a slow-motion encirclement, and they were trying to paint me as the, in quote, unstable, heavily armed veteran, in quote, to justify whatever move they were going to make next. I called an old buddy of mine, Miller, who's a deputy over in the next county, and he told me under his breath that the HOA had filed a, in quote, wellness concern, in quote, against me, claiming I was threatening board members. The civilian version of painting a target on my back. I didn't in oppos. To get angry, I just went back to my grandfather's old leather-bound journals and started looking for the one thing I knew had to be there. Gramps wasn't in oppos. Just a rancher. He was a surveyor for the state back in the 50s, and he had a way of keeping records that would make a librarian weep. I found a sketch of the Southern well, the one those guys were digging at, with a note in his shaky handwriting that said, in quote, the line that doesn't end oppos, move, in quote. That night, I decided to play their game. I put a decoy notebook out in the shed, something that looked real enough from a distance, and I rigged a few silent sensors I kept from my time overseas. At 1:40 a.m., my tablet chirped. Two shadows were in my shed, one of them being that, in quote, neighborly, in quote, Guy Lewis, who tried to offer me fencing help a few days prior. I didn't in oppos. Called the cops. I just walked out there with the shotgun and racked a shell, and that sound, that beautiful metallic, in quote, clack clack, in quote, stopped them dead. The heavy-set guy with him bolted, but I caught Lewis in the irrigation ditch after he tripped over his own ego. I didn't in oppos. Heard him, just pinned him down and went through his pack, finding forged HOA entry orders, plat maps with weird curved boundaries that didn't in oppos. Make any sense, and photos of my well casing. He started shaking, telling me they told him whatever was under that well was, in quote, worth millions, in quote, and that he was just trying to get his cut. That was the missing piece. They weren't in oppos. After the land because they liked the view. They were after it because they thought there was oil or some kind of mineral wealth sitting right under my boots. The day of the hearing felt like walking into a lion's den. If the lions wore navy blazers and carried overpriced leather briefcases. Diana Sterling sat at the front of the room, looking like she'd already won, while her lawyer, a guy named Vance who smelled like expensive cigars and arrogance, started spinning a tale about a 1994 agreement where my grandfather had supposedly signed over the ranch to the association. He held up this document like it was the Ten Commandments, but I just sat there next to my lawyer, a sharp-as-a-tack woman named Sarah who grew up 3 miles from my gate. When it was our turn, Sarah didn't end oppos. Start with a speech. She just turned on the projector and showed the 1953 original deed to the broken spur. It had a specific clause, one that Diana had clearly overlooked, that protected the ranch from any future governance unless the owner signed a new deed, not just a, in quote, membership agreement, end quote. Then Sarah dropped the real hammer. She showed a side-by-side of the signature on Vance's document and my grandfather's actual signature from his military discharge papers. It wasn't oppos, even close. But the kicker? The notary stamp on the HOA and oppos. S document was for a commission that didn't end oppos. to even exist until 2018. The room went silent, the kind of silence that usually precedes a car crash. Sarah then called Lewis to the stand. Turns out, when you catch a guy trespassing, he gets real talkative when you offer not to press charges. He admitted on the record that Diana had paid him to forge those documents and spy on my property to find the, treasure, they thought was hidden under the well. The judge, a man who looked like he'd seen enough nonsense to last 3 lifetimes, didn't end oppose to even hesitate. He vacated the lien, ordered my accounts unfrozen, and then looked Diana dead in the eye and told her he was referring the whole mess to the district attorney for fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. As the deputies let her out, and yeah, seeing those cuffs click on her wrist was a better feeling than any drink I've ever had, she hissed at me that I didn't end oppose to even know what I was standing on. She still thought there was gold down there. I just watched her go, feeling the weight of the last month finally start to lift off my shoulders. I drove back to the ranch as the sun was dipping behind the peaks, painting the whole valley in that deep, honest orange that makes you realize why people fight for land in the first place. I walked out to the southern well, the one everyone was so obsessed with, and I knelt down by the stone ring my grandfather had built. I found a hidden hinge he'd mentioned in his notes, and pried open a small, lead-line vault tucked into the foundation. Inside wasn't oppos, T-gold, or oil, or diamonds. It was a heavy, brass survey marker, polished and etched with the exact coordinates of the original state line. Gramps knew that in the future, people would try to move boundaries with pens and paper, so he buried the one thing that couldn't and oppos. TB argued with, the physical truth of the earth. It wasn't an oppos, T worth millions to a bank, but to me, it was worth everything. I put it back, sealed the vault, and spent the rest of the evening fixing my gate and hanging a new sign, and private land. Respect the line, and Now, I see the neighbors watching from the road sometimes, wondering if the rumors about, the veteran and his secret stash, are true, and honestly, let them wonder. It keeps the trespassers away. But it makes me think about how many people are out there right now, being squeezed by these tiny neighborhood dictators who think they can rewrite the rules of the world just because they have a clipboard and a G-Wagon. It's funny how a little bit of brass and some old-fashioned record-keeping can bring a whole empire down. ISN and oppos. It? But look, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to deal with an HOA that thought they owned the air you breathe, or a neighbor who tried to, reimagine, your property line? Is there ever a time when these associations actually do more good than harm? Or are they all just power trips waiting to happen? Drop a comment and tell me your story, because out here, the only thing more valuable than the land is the truth of who actually owns it.